right, so back to contraception. We're going to talk about barrier methods next. So we include spermicides in the barrier methods because they're used with actually more solid barriers, but also they do function as somewhat of a barrier to prevent sperm from reaching the ovum. So spermicides are chemicals that attack the flagella of the sperm and the body of the sperm and prevent the sperm from reaching the cervix. They can be in several different forms that can be foam, gel, suppository, creams, or films. They must be applied according to instructions. Make sure that your patient understands the instructions on the box. They are available over the counter. They should be applied no more than 1 hour before intercourse because they'll begin to become ineffective after that. They're most effective when they're combined with other barrier methods like condoms or diaphragms. There's no evidence, however, that spermicides make condoms more effective. So condoms make spermicides more effective. There's no evidence that spermicides make condoms more effective. Let me say that again. Condoms make spermicides more effective. There's no evidence that spermicides make condoms more effective. I don't know if I said that right the first time or not. Some of the risk or drawbacks, they are prone to causing inflammation, allergy, and irritation. Frequent use because of that inflammation to the tissue may increase the transmission of HIV and other STIs. So if someone is exposed to an STI by intercourse, our body does attempt to prevent that infection, and the inflammation caused by spermicides actually makes that infection more likely. They also have to be reapplied with every episode of intercourse. And the failure rate with these used as they typically are is 15 to 29%. So they're pretty high. The reason it's such a wide range is because they looked at different types of spermicides. So not the best option as a sole method of preventing contraception, but they can be useful with other barriers. Condoms, male condoms, are a thin, stretchable sheath. They can be made of latex, polyurethane, or lamb cecum, which is natural skin. Latex and polyurethane condoms also provide protection against STIs. Lambskin do not. So skin condoms do not protect against STIs. Latex is slightly more effective at preventing pregnancy than polyurethane. And that's probably because latex is stretchier, polyurethane may be a little bit more likely to break. The drawbacks, latex allergy, obviously, breaking or slipping. And that's more likely with polyurethane. Damage if it's not stored properly. Petroleum-based lubricants break down latex. So a lot of times people don't realize that. And there are people who are still using petroleum jelly as a lubricant. And that's going to break down latex condoms. Most condoms now are made with a sperm reservoir at the tip. If a person is using condoms that don't have a reservoir, they need to be taught how to create a reservoir at the end of that condom when it's put on. And that's done by twisting the end just a little bit, unroll the condom slightly, twist the end just a little bit, roll the condom on while keeping the twist in place. And then when that little twist at the end is released, it makes a reservoir. The failure rate for condoms with typical use is 13%, and with perfect use is 2%. So what's the difference between typical and perfect use? Perfect use is using a condom every single time and using it the entire time the penis is in the vagina. So it's fairly common for couples to begin intercourse without a condom, stop and put the condom on because there are complaints of reduced sensation. And in that case, there's a risk of unexpected ejaculation, which could lead to pregnancy. The other major reason for failure is going to be not allowing space for the ejaculation. Female condoms are a nitrile sheath and a barrier attached to 2 flexible rings. I'm actually going to find a picture of this so that you can get a mental image of it. We don't see these quite as frequently. Okay, so let's look at this image. So a female condom has an internal ring. This internal ring is placed around the cervix. It needs to be placed up behind the pubic bone. And that internal ring has it's something like a diaphragm. It has a barrier. And then it also has a continuous barrier that lines the vaginal wall that's kept in place with an external ring. So this external ring sits outside the introitus of the vagina. So the internal ring is going to be flexible for placement. Placement is going to be similar to placing a diaphragm. And then the sheath will line the vagina. The external ring sits outside the vagina to prevent the sheath from being moved inside during intercourse. So these also are protective against STI, and they're more protective against herpes and HPV than male condoms, simply because they cover more external skin. Herpes and HPV can both infect the skin of the external genitalia. And so covering more skin actually helps lower the risk of transmitting both of those. The risks and drawbacks, they are more expensive than male condoms. A lot of users complain that they're noisy and awkward. Sometimes people want to double up. They use a male and a female condom. They think that's safer. If they're used together, they're actually both more likely to tear. So it's one or the other. The failure rate with typical use is 21%, with perfect use is 5%. So they're a little less effective at preventing pregnancy than male condoms. A diaphragm is a shallow dome-shaped latex or silicone device with a flexible rim. Again, let's find a picture and look. Okay, so let's look at the diaphragm now. This is what a diaphragm looks like. It is a flexible latex or silicone. It's a flexible ring with a latex or silicone barrier. This rim is folded for insertion. Spermicidal jelly is placed inside the diaphragm. The rim is folded, the diaphragm is folded and inserted and allowed to unfold. And then it has to be pushed into place behind the pubis symphysis. It needs to be appropriately sized. Size may change with major changes in weight or with childbirth. It needs to be placed several hours prior to intercourse. More spermicide is applied vaginally if there's more than one episode of intercourse. It doesn't need to be removed for that, but more spermicide needs to be inserted vaginally. And it needs to be removed 6 to 8 hours after intercourse. So some of the risk, rarely this can lead to toxic shock syndrome. Allergy or irritation is more common, in particular with latex models. It requires the woman to be very comfortable touching her genitals, and it can be messy. The failure rate with typical use is 17%, with perfect use is 16%. So it still has a pretty high failure rate. The silicone cap, let's look at what this diaphragm looks like in place. So let's make this image a little bit larger. So it's placed basically around the cervix, okay, forms a barrier. The cervical cap, and let's look at this, is a much smaller barrier that goes just over the cervix. These are a few different models. You'll notice they all have some way of removing them. These are typically silicone. Spermicide is placed inside the cap, and the cap is placed prior to intercourse. It needs to remain in place at least 6 hours, but this can remain in place for up to 48 hours. No additional spermicide is needed for additional episodes of intercourse. The correct size must be used, and it needs to be refitted after weight loss or gain and birth, it is a little bit less effective than a diaphragm. The same risk apply. Toxic shock syndrome is rare, but it occurs. It can lead to allergy or irritation. It requires the woman to put her her fingers inside the vagina to place it, and it can be messy. So let's look at what this looks like in place. And it's, again, just over the cervix. The cervical cap can safely remain in place for longer. The next type of barrier contraceptive we're going to look at is the contraceptive sponge. And at one time, these had been removed from the US market. Let's actually look and see. We're going to talk about them a little bit, and then we're going to look and see if they're back on the market. It's a polyurethane sponge that's impregnated with spermicide. One size fits all. They were available over the counter. They're moistened with water and placed prior to intercourse. They need to be left in place at least 6 hours. They can't stay any longer than 24 to 30 hours. And they're most effective for women who've never had a baby. Having a baby actually enlarges the cervical opening permanently, and so it makes this less effective. Toxic shock syndrome may happen, but it is rare. They can cause allergy or irritation because of the spermicide. It requires touching the genitals. The failure rate with typical use, that is not 12 to 2%. We're going to consult our chart on that, but with perfect use is 17 to 27%. It's most effective in nulliparous women. So let's look up a couple of things. Let's look at our contraceptive chart for that failure rate that somehow got messed up in the notes. I'll fix those notes for you. And then let's look at whether this is available. Okay, so let's pull up this is an updated list of failure rates, and the sponge, the updated rates are 9 to 20%, depending on whether the woman has or has not had a baby for perfect use, 14 to 27% for typical use. So, and that's actually a change. I'm going to make a note and I can adjust that. I don't want you to stress about the I don't want you to stress about the specific percentages. What I want you to do is be able to group these methods by which ones are more effective, which ones are least effective. And I want you to know what makes them more or less effective. Okay, so don't try to memorize the numbers. The numbers are there to help you figure out which ones are more effective, which ones are least effective. Also, the Today sponge is available in the US. That is the only contraceptive sponge available. Okay, so that's the end of the barrier method section. And next we're going to talk about hormonal methods.